The kidnapping of Steven Stayner from Merced, California in 1972 is one of the most well-known kidnappings in history. Subject of many articles, books, newscasts, movies, and podcasts, the story has been covered by many. While Steven was alive, he was often unhappy in interviews about the coverage of his case and the focus on lurid details to the exclusion of everything else. Join us as we cover the story of the life and kidnapping of Steven Stayner and try to give a fuller picture of the places, time period, and history that his kidnapping happens in. This is the first episode in the series subtitled Kenneth Parnell. So welcome to California True Crime. I'm Jessica and I'll be your host for this episode. And with me are Sean and Charles. Thank you both for joining me. How are you guys tonight?
I'm doing excellent.
Doing very well.
Good. Most of our episodes start with us saying something about how we had never heard of the crime. This won't be the case tonight because we're covering a very famous crime and a crime that's been covered by a lot of podcasts. And this was one of the first things that YouTube actually talked about before I even sort of showed up for the podcast.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was always on our minds as something we could talk about when we talked about starting the podcast. So we've been talking about this one for a long time now.
Almost a year.
Yeah.
And researching it for that long, too.
Right.
It was one of the first ones we went to the library and tried to get information on. So during this year, we've talked a lot about whether or not we still need to cover it because so many podcasts have covered it. And we came up with a few reasons why we should. One of them is because we're from the Central Valley, and that's where Merced is. So even though we weren't alive when this happened at first, we sort of feel like we want to tell the story about the places that it happened, just kind of like we normally do, but these are places that are really important to us. The other thing is that from our research, we saw a lot of interviews where Steven Stayner was upset about some of the ways that he was covered, only painting him as a victim and never talking about the rest of his life. And so we really wanted to try to do some sort of justice to that story. We'll obviously be covering the more difficult parts of the story. So if that's something you might not want to hear about, just be aware that we will be talking about a lot of difficult things. The major reason that we're covering Steven Stayner is because I feel like in other things that we've seen, his story often gets lost into the Carrie Stayner story or is told as a lead up to a much bigger story. And I really feel, we're going to cover both, but I really feel like he deserves his own episodes, this is his life, this is what happened to him. It matters that it's his. So that's sort of why we decided to do it. And as we said, we will sort of be talking about Kenneth Parnell and his background. And if you don't know this story, that's the person who comes to Merced and kidnaps Steven Stayner. But we will have episodes throughout that sort of tell the story from different perspectives. So this will be about Kenneth Parnell. We will be talking about Steven Stayner's family. We'll be telling the story of Timothy White. So that's just kind of what you can expect from all these episodes. And just to give you a quick idea of where we got all of the information for these episodes, we have been studying this for about a year or so and used over 200 different articles. We went to some of the towns where these happened in. We used the Merced Sun-Star and the Ukiah paper to get all the information, and we'll point that out when we're in specific episodes. And if you are interested in more information, you can always check out our works cited list to find exactly where we found the information. The other thing is that since this did happen where we're from, it kind of affected our parents, we think, and some of the stuff that they went through, or maybe how they worried about strangers and things like that. Sometimes I think the cases that happen nearer to where you live have a bigger effect. I don't know. Did you guys have a case growing up, like a kidnapping, that sort of affected you?
No, I was trying to think of that when we started this last year and starting looking into it. I don't think, not a kidnapping. No, I do remember poly class. That was a big one when we were younger, but I don't think it was more of like it was on the news everywhere.
As a kid, all I remember is that my grandparents came here from down south and lived with us for, I don't know, a month or two because of the Night Stalker.
Oh, wow.
And that was really, I was young, but I remember my grandparents being here because they were scared of the Night Stalker.
That's incredible. I know we asked some of our followers, right, Charles?
Yeah. So we appreciate all of our our people that reach out to us on Facebook and our Twitter. This was actually a question we put out to our followers on Facebook. Basically, what was a kidnapping that happened when you were younger that you remember that had an emotional impact on you? And Vanessa Butler was Stayner. That was a big one for her. Jessica, and I apologize if I'm saying her name incorrectly, but De Silva said that there was a kidnapping of Michaela Garrett, I think is how you say it, the name, but that's from Hayward, and that was 20 years ago. Also, Richard Rivali had mentioned polyclass as well, and one that came up and actually sparked a pretty good discussion was Vicky Gervais's, that was the Chowchilla bus incident.
Oh, that's one we've talked about quite a bit.
Right. And Kelly Husky mentioned Anthony Martinez, who was kidnapped from Beaumont down by LA. So we thank you for answering our poll on our Facebook page. And Jessica, I think you had an answer from Twitter?
Yeah, I had an interesting one on Twitter from Dawn Laurie. She talked about something called the Springfield 3, which I had never heard about. These 3 women go missing, and they've still not found them. But it made me notice that a lot of people seem to talk about ones that were close to them. They seem to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, sometimes it's just national news, and you can't place yourself there because you don't know the location in a way. But when they're closer, it really hits home.
Yeah. So just to give you a heads up, the Steven Stayner story will be a series of episodes. I don't know that we're sure how many quite yet, but it will be at least 3. And this episode tonight, we're going to be talking mainly about Kenneth Parnell. We'll set the story up a little and do some background on the man who kidnapped him. And just so you also know, we will be covering the Yosemite murders after, so we won't be ignoring that aspect. And actually, Sean will be covering that. The kidnapping of Steven Stayner takes place in Merced, California on December 4th, 1972. Merced is in California's Central Valley, which we've talked a lot about before. Merced sits right at State Route 99, or Highway 99, as most of us call it who live here. And Highway 99 runs through the Central Valley, connecting the south and north ends of the state, and also at the north it connects to other states.
Yeah, it goes all the way up to Washington.
Merced is what we call a pass-through town. We don't actually live in Merced, but we also live in a pass-through town, meaning a town that isn't a destination unto itself. Unless you have family or friends or something in Merced, you probably aren't likely to visit there, to make that where you're going to go on your trip. It's a town that you pass through. I don't know, where we live, I always have people, they'll ask me where you live, and I'll say, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And then I'll say, oh, have you ever been to Yosemite? And they're like, oh. So to me, that's like a pass-through town.
Right.
Well, especially I think in Northern California, in Central Valley, on the north side of it, there's a lot of these towns that is the end result. You go there to go to Yosemite.
Yeah, Merced definitely has that. You can go through Merced to get to Yosemite. That's really common. But it's also right on the 99. So you might go through it if you're going to LA or maybe to San Francisco. And there's a lot of places right off the freeway there. You might stop to get gas. It might be a place you know because you went to fast food. There
was a place called the Pinecone Inn that we would always stop there on the way to Disneyland. It was for breakfast and then get like pancakes and then take off. It was kind of a tradition.
Was it on the...
It was on the 99, right there at the beginning of Merced.
But going to Yosemite is the main reason you might go through Merced. In fact, Merced is known as the gateway to Yosemite, and it has one of the most important roads in California history running right through it, and that's State Route 140 or Highway 140. Highway 140 runs directly from Yosemite National Park all the way down through the foothills and directly into Merced. And by car, it would take you an hour and 30 minutes, according to Google Maps, to get to Yosemite from Merced. We've talked several times about the gold rush and its effect on towns in our episodes. Stockton, for instance, was a town that grew up in large part because of the gold rush. We'll be talking a bit about the gold rush here too, but we should note that California history, it doesn't actually begin or end with the gold rush. It certainly is a very important moment, but there's a lot of history we haven't gotten to, so hopefully we can do that in some other episodes. One of the things the gold rush did do was necessitate the need for roads in California, roads that would just bring stuff people were mining down from Yosemite or the mountains in general. And the beginning of the gold rush, there were a couple of main ways. There were 2 competing stage routes, and these routes would bring people back and forth, as Yosemite was a tourist area very early on. And it would also bring food to miners and workers from the different farming communities in the Central Valley. Highway 140 would become one of the first all-weather roads in 1926. And as time moves forward, more people have cars, they want to go to Yosemite, so this road becomes really important for tourists as well as for people living in Yosemite who work there. But you have to come down. There's nothing up there really at this time. But even now, you're probably coming down to see doctors, to go shopping, that sort of stuff. So the two places are really interconnected, Merced and Yosemite, which is sort of a pet peeve of mine when people talk about this case because they're always so surprised that Yosemite and Merced come up a lot. But they're really interconnected. It's not that much of a coincidence.
No, I agree with you because I think, especially when we deal with the Central Valley, that there are a lot of places that are close and connected by some of these major arteries, the 120, the 140, the 99. So to say that it's a coincidence that this would happen or the coincidence that something else would happen, it's not. It's interconnectivity, like you said, because we're that close to one another. It's easy to get from point A to point B. So many of us are used to traveling to certain places to do certain activities.
I think if you didn't grow up here or Merced, I have never had the connection between Yosemite and Merced. Anytime I'm in Merced, I never think about going to Yosemite. Anytime I'm in Merced, hanging out with friends, Yosemite never comes up. So I understand what you're saying. I would have never think that the two are connected.
And I think that right there is what constantly amazes me about our state, because for like Merced, they're as close to Yosemite as almost they are to San Francisco. And we in the Central Valley are so close to so many different places that I think it's interesting where connections lie and how close and how interconnected these places really are when you take a step back.
Well, and a lot of places in Merced have mountain names. I mean, you mentioned the Pinecone Inn.
Right.
I mean, Merced's not really mountainy, but it's so connected to the mountains that, of course, you would name it that. And a lot of the businesses their taglines say that they serve both Merced as well as the mountain region. And I just think you might live here in the Central Valley. I know a few people who've never been to Yosemite. But a lot of people who are here, I know we grew up, we were always in the mountains doing things. So the fact that someone would live here and then go work somewhere in the mountains or Yosemite, there's a lot of other places than just the park, but it just seems, of course they're connected. That makes sense to me.
Right. And I think another thing, though, too, is that how we talk about California, it's the most populated state. We're connected to like everything because you can't go you're not like in Montana where, I'm just going to drive for 9 hours to the next like town. You are always connected to anything. There's no real long drives where you're not somewhere.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, maybe I'm way north where it's mainly just woods, but Central Valley and Southern California, you're always connected to something, it seems like. And
even in a place where we would think of as kind of out of the way, you're still a stone's throw from a major thoroughfare. The 99, the I-5, the 120, the 108, the 140, all of these big roads that connect all of these, like you said, pass-through towns. I think that takes away that distance that, without those roads, maybe it would feel a lot farther away.
Yeah, and it probably connects people too, because like I said, people know your town because they drove through it, and we get thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people from all over the world who go through our town to go to some of these bigger places. So everything is sort of connected. But an hour and a half is not that far away. So it kind of makes sense to me that, this happens.
Yeah.
Merced is the largest town in Merced County. And in 2017, the population was about 86,000 people. It's a rather large suburban city, but in terms of other Central Valley cities, that are just up the road from it, it's actually not that big. Ones we've talked about, Modesto and Stockton, those are much bigger. It's known for dairies, chicken, farms, almonds, apricots, peaches, and nectarines, just to name a few things. Merced became incorporated in 1889 and was named after the Merced River, which is nearby in the city. Merced is also known for a few other things. Charles, did you want to tell us about Castle Air Force Base?
Yeah, Castle Air Force Museum is located in Atwater, which is a small town just outside of Merced. Castle Air Force Museum is the largest aviation museum between Southern California and the state of Washington. It has over 70 restored vintage military aircraft on exhibit, and the museum is adjacent to the former Castle Air Force Base, which is now called Castle Airport, and it officially opened to the public in 1981.
And Sean, you spent a lot of time in Merced, right?
Yeah, I have a lot of friends there. It was in like the Central Valley music scene. Merced and Modesto were kind of like somehow grouped together, or we formed this bond. And so I used to hang out like at the Tioga Hotel, where it's kind of a famous old hotel where Nixon was there when he was trying to become governor. And at the hotel, Marilyn Monroe and other people have stayed there and stuff like that. But then Merced, I mean, there's a pretty decent nightlife there. There's a place called The Partisan, which is amazing. You can go see live music. They just reopened it, and it's an amazing place. So if anyone's in Merced, go check out The Partisan. But I like Merced. I have a lot of friends.
Yeah, it has one of my, well, actually, I guess Atwater, but they have a restaurant in Merced too. One of my favorite sandwiches is at Jan's Bakery. It's the most amazing chicken sandwich. And on Wednesdays, they have free pie. So,
Oh, wow.
if you're ever in Merced, stop by.
It's a free slice of pie. Let's make sure that I don't want anyone showing up that are expecting an entire pie.
Yeah, but if you have like 6 of you, then you put 6 slices together and you make a full pie.
That's correct.
There
That's
you
right.
go. We're part tourism board as well as a true crime podcast. In 1972, Merced is a much smaller town than it is now. It had a population of only 22,670 people, so it's a moderately small town. It's still the biggest town in its county. And most things we researched said it was a super small town. I know a lot of the 2020s and stuff are always talking about how sleepy and tiny it is.
That's the worst. Sleepy Town, the term Sleepy Town is the worst on all those shows.
But I mean, it has 4 high schools now. I think 4 high schools. That's a big town to me.
Right.
Well, I think too, it's what you consider sleepy. I think some of those 2020s are trying to paint a certain pastoral picture of those towns when, like you said, Merced's big. I always think of it as a big town.
Yeah, it's the biggest in its county. It's not Modesto, and it's certainly not LA or San Francisco, but there are far smaller towns out here in the Central Valley.
But the problem is when you watch like any of the Lacey Peterson shows about Modesto, Sleepy Town. Heard it every episode.
Yeah, it's not.
No.
One of the families that lived in Merced at the time was the Stayner family. On April 18th, 1965, Delbert and Kay Stayner had welcomed a baby boy into their family and named him Steven Gregory Stayner. Steven would be the middle child of 5 children. He had an older brother named Carrie and an older sister named Cindy. After Steven was born, 2 more siblings would follow, both girls named Corey and Jody. The Stayners were a hard-working blue-collar family. Steven's father, Delbert Stayner, had served as a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army in the 1950s and was working as a mechanic for the California Canners and Growers Association in the 1970s. In 1967, a couple of years after Steven was born, the Stayners would move near Snelling, California, after buying a 20-acre almond farm. Snelling is a very small town, 28 miles from Merced, and as a rural area, it had only a few hundred people living there. In fact, the population in 2010 was 231. It was originally called Snelling Ranch, named after a family who ran a way station there with the last name Snelling, and it was Merced's original county seat, so it had one of its first courthouses, which were pretty important places at the time. Often sheriffs would bring people down from the mountains. A lot of these places down here in the Central Valley, there's a few of them, are known for hangings, because that's where you would bring people and kind of try them. But its courthouse actually was around until 1990 as a courthouse. And I think it's still there, so we'll put some pictures up on social media. It kind of looks like a courthouse you would see in a movie.
Does it do anything now?
I don't think so, but it's a really beautiful little building that you might see in a TV show or a movie like Andy Griffith or even something. It looks kind of southern. I don't know if that's a thing, but Steven was known as a polite and shy child who loved being outside on the family's ranch. Ranch life offers a freedom to kids to sort of run around, and he spent a lot of his time doing this and following his father around the farm. He was generally seen running around with his dog named Daisy. Ranching, though, is a difficult job and can be unpredictable. Changing weather patterns, unforeseen pest issues, all of these can cause large issues for ranchers who can easily lose everything. Almonds are also an expensive crop with the possibility of a high return, but that return can take several years, and this would actually be before the big almond boom that's happening now in California had started. As such, Delbert kept his job working as a mechanic, as well as working on his ranch and selling his almonds to Blue Diamond. Unfortunately, an injury in a dry season would force the family to sell their land and move back into Merced. Once in Merced, they settled into a pale green, 1-story, and 3-bedroom house on Betty Street and enrolled their kids into Merced schools. Moving to the city after living on a farm was a very difficult move for Steven. He was used to being able to run around freely, and that changed. He also had to give away his loved dog Daisy because town living wasn't good for her. The family still had 2 other dogs they loved, named Puggy and Brownie, and Steven was still able to spend time doing some of his family's favorite activities. The Stayners were a family that loved being outdoors. Camping, fishing, swimming in their backyard pool were just a few of the things they enjoyed doing. And these were kind of the same activities my family did as kids. We were really outdoor kids. I don't know about you two.
I was more of an indoor kid. Yeah, I'd like to say something else, but I was an indoor kid for most of it.
Yeah, I hate the sun. It's like the worst thing unless it's wintertime. Warms you up. I was very much like you, indoors with my Atari or Nintendo and my TurboGrafx 16.
But in 1972, a man named Kenneth Parnell would come to Merced, California, and change everything for the Stayner family. Kenneth Parnell was born in Amarillo, Texas, on September 26, 1932. 1932 was a big year for movies. Both The Mummy and Freaks came out in 1932, and if you're into true crime, the movie The Most Dangerous Game came out in 1932 as well. And that's a big movie for true crime fans because...
Zodiac. If you know the story of Zodiac, The Most Dangerous Game seemed to be a big influence to him. In one of his first cipher, it said that hunting man is the most dangerous game, and supposedly I think his name's Zarloff or something, like the bad guy in it. It starts with a Z, so people like try and the Zodiac case, there's so many like people try to really figure out who it is, but this was supposedly a big influence for the Zodiac.
Parnell was born to Cecil Frederick and Mary Olive Parnell. His mother was a strict fundamentalist and a practical nurse. This just means that she wasn't an actual registered nurse. I don't know if she worked for a doctor or in a hospital or for a family, but she wasn't actually registered to be a nurse. His father worked in diners and was an alcoholic. Around 1938 or 1939, the Parnell family would move to California. I'm not sure why they moved to California so suddenly. I didn't get an exact reason for this family, but it was in the middle of something called the Great Migration. And Charles, you're going to tell us about the Great Migration.
Yeah, the Great Migration it's also known as the Dust Bowl, is really what kind of started it. So in the late 1930s, a series of droughts and blights on a lot of the farms in the Midwest caused a loss of topsoil, and actually they were called black blizzards. So you have windstorms kicking up all this dust, and it's basically destroying massive amounts of farmland. And so those poor farmers had nowhere to go. Banks were foreclosing on farmland that had been in generations. So these families were displaced, and families from all throughout the Midwest and the South moved west because of the idea that it was a better life. And about 2.5 million moved into California, and a huge portion of those were from Texas.
This is the time period in which the Parnell family would come to California. I don't know if the dad came with them at the same time. I've seen different things. His father does leave the family at a young age, and I don't know if it's before they leave to come to California or after. There is evidence that he shows up in California near where they are, and they settle in Bakersfield. He comes here with his mom, his 2 half-sisters, and a half-brother, and that's where they live. Bakersfield is at the southern end of the Central Valley. Chances are you've probably heard of this California city. It's in Kern County. Bakersfield was named after a lawyer named John Baker, who came to California during the gold rush and settled on the edge of the Kern River. His property became known as Bakersfield, and when Bakersfield incorporated in 1873, it became Bakersfield. And again, history didn't start during this time period or during the gold rush. In fact, there's a pretty unique history for Bakersfield during this time period that hopefully we'll get to. Bakersfield is the 9th largest city in California, and it was a rather large city during the time the Parnell family lived there. As Charles said, a lot of people came from different states, and this was a place they really settled. In 1950, for instance, it had a population of 113,805 people. People flooded into Bakersfield when in 1865 oil was found. And oil is just not the first thing even I think about when I think about in California, but it dramatically changed Bakersfield and that whole area. And one of the major reasons was because people came there during the Great Migration. So oil is really important.
Yeah, and this is something that I think if you drive around California, especially Southern California or the southern part of the Central Valley, you will see oil derricks, the big machines that are pumping oil out. And oil's discovered in California in the 19th century, but it really picks off right after the 1900s. So in 1914, California actually accounts for 38% of the national production of oil. And in 2012, California actually produced 197 million barrels of crude oil, which and most of those are from Kern County, Los Angeles, again, the southern part of the state, and that represents 8%, 8.3% of the national stockpile of oil, which is again crazy to me. But with the Great Migration, and you have a lot of these out of work farmers, and oil production is booming at this time, that a lot of these small towns that spring up around these oil derricks are going to need a really cheap labor force. And then here comes all of these out of work farmers.
And actually, when the Parnell family moves to Bakersfield, his mother runs a boarding house that caters to single men who work in the oil fields. So it's kind of just an interesting connection. Bakersfield is also really known for a few other things, and one of them is music, right, Sean?
Yeah, Bakersfield has some pretty interesting history when it comes to music. There's some very famous people that I think everyone know. One, Merle Haggard, who passed away in 2016. He was part of that outlaw country with like Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash kind of grouped in there. He had Okie from Muskogee, and he actually had a song called A Bar in Bakersfield. And another country music star, but not so much like Merle Haggard, was Buck Owens. And he had a song called Act Naturally, which he actually didn't like at first. Someone said, hey, try this song, and he didn't think he liked it. But then in 1963, it was a really big hit for him. And then in 1965, the Beatles actually covered it with Ringo Starr singing it. And then in 1988, Ringo decided to re-release it, but he did it as a duet with Buck Owens. So it all came full circle with that. There was a lot of covers of that song, like Dwight Yoakam did it. And the thing that I found really weird is that they all sound exactly the same. You did not even need to cover it. It was just pretty much the same song over and over. But another famous band out of Bakersfield was Korn. And I mean, I think everyone knows Korn. I don't really want to talk about them. But one weird thing is that Jonathan Davis, he's the lead singer of Korn. His dad, Rick Davis, was actually the keyboard player for Buck Owens. So it might be a big town, but it seems like the music community might have been small.
It's interesting, too, to think about that sound or that kind of music being there. But then when you think about all the people coming from Texas and other places.
Right. It has that. Like I don't often think of like country music coming out of California, but it makes sense.
In the 1930s, as I said, the Parnell family would come to Bakersfield. Kenneth Parnell's father, who I believe had already left the family by this time, worked as a short order cook in Bakersfield. And his mom managed a boarding house, as I said. And I just wanted to mention this because it's at 1805 California Street. And even though it's not a boarding house, there's still an apartment building there. So I just found that kind of interesting. During Parnell's childhood, he was in and out of trouble. When he was 4 years old, he tried to pull out 4 of his teeth, I believe with his own fingers.
Oh, God.
When he was 9 years old, he shone a light into his eyes so long he did permanent damage and needed glasses. As he aged, he became suicidal, but he was still pretty young, which I found I just never really think about little kids that age being suicidal, but it was something that was a really big deal for him. He would tell a psychiatrist that he thought about committing suicide at least once a month. He attempted suicide a couple of times, including shooting himself in the stomach and jumping off either a barn or a shed onto a pile of wood with nails. The nails were pointed up. He also drank a bottle of disinfectant.
When he jumped into the wood pile, did it find anything that he went to the hospital? Did he get nails stuck in him or anything? Or?
He obviously lived through all of it. He was hurt, I think, but not really severely in any of these instances. And suicide in children, just so we can talk about it for a second, it is very rare. In 2016, there were only 2 in every 1 million kids ages 5 to 11 who were suicidal. And ages 12 to 17, it was 52 in every 1 million kids, which is, like I said, it's rare. It's not something you should worry about, but it just surprised me that he was so suicidal at a young age. And I guess it's not I don't know what the word is. Uncommon is not the right word, but it happens. And the study shows that kids know what suicide is from a really young age, around 5 or 6. Most of them don't understand totally what it is, but they've heard the words. They know what killing themselves is. And as kids get older, they have a greater understanding of what it is. So if you are worried about this, I'm just going to put this National Suicide Hotline number here, and we'll put it up on our social media. It's 1-800-273-TALK, or you can always ask your doctor or a mental health professional for a referral for your kids or for someone you know if you think they need help.
Again, this is a kid who's done it repeatedly, though, right? I mean, he tried to shoot himself. Now, did he actually shoot himself in the stomach, or was...
The stuff I saw wasn't specific onto what happened after he did these things, but it did say that he shot himself in the stomach. So I don't know if he spent time in a hospital or what happened after that. Around the age of 13 or 15, around that time period, Parnell got into trouble with police when he set a fire in a field outside Bakersfield. When he talks to police, he tells them he did this after he was raped by a man at his mother's boarding house. This is a claim Parnell will say later isn't true when he's much older, but it is something he tells police. And knowing that men are coming in and out of the boarding house, and is a vulnerable kid. And I think, too, we're going to talk about this later, but the idea or how people are perceived who have been abused or raped, especially boys and men, for him to recant because of all of the stereotypes and stigma attached to that, it makes sense that he might recant even though it actually happened. In his teens, he would steal 2 cars and be sent multiple times to reform school in California, including a place called the Fred C. Nellis School for Boys. This was a reform school in Whittier, California. Whittier is in Los Angeles, California, and about 2 hours and 45 minutes to get to there from Bakersfield. So probably, in my mind, even longer in the 1930s or 40s when this happens. The word school is misleading. It doesn't really describe what this place is like. It was really more of a prison for youth. The school that he went to closes in 2004 and has been actually in several movies and TV shows, including Bad Teacher, Red State, and the TV show Prison Break. And reform schools have a long history in California. They go back to just basically when we became a state. We won't go through all of that because Parnell isn't going to them for all that time. But they were originally run as work farms, and they were just really terrible. They used violent punishments. By the time Parnell goes to reform school, they've already sort of been reformed themselves, but they still aren't perfect. They are more like a school, but they still basically look like a jail. There's a mix of kids who've committed crimes, arson, things like that, but there's also kids who've just run away. They do have an actual school where before they didn't. There's about 3 hours of school. There are girls at the school Parnell goes to, but they have a separate area where they learn sewing and housekeeping. And it sort of really depends on the school and how it's run. When Parnell is there, it's run under a man named Erasmus J. Mills, and he is known to sort of run things with an iron hand. There are some strange deaths at the time Parnell's there that are never explained. They use chemical restraints, which is drugging the kids, and sex abuse runs rampant. So for Parnell, who's having a lot of issues, he's suicidal, he's committing crimes, he's still a young child, and he's sent here to get help. And there's really not mechanisms involved there that will actually help him in any way. Later, a psychiatrist would say that sexual activity at reform schools was an everyday thing. We should remember, they didn't say between kids or between adults. I don't know that that matters. These are kids, like we said, who are really vulnerable because of the situation that they're in. And so this is predatory behavior. That's how I looked at it when I read it. Which leads to the other issue that we saw when we researched this case, and one we'll confront more fully in a few minutes, but I will mention it here, and that is that for far too long and during this time period, much of the rape will be called, quote, homosexual sex by judges and police. This is a time period in which homosexuality is considered a mental illness, and you really get a sense of that when reading these old articles. And to see the justice system conflate pedophilia with homosexuality is really hard to read. It's really hard to research. But if we're going to talk about California in a historically accurate way and cover what happened to everyone in this story in an accurate way, we have to talk about this because during this time in the California justice system, these two things are linked. And this will directly affect later how people deal with being raped or assaulted. That linking of these two things, which are different in every way imaginable, has unfortunate complications for people who suffer abuse and who fear coming forward and talking about it. And that lasts, I think, you see the flicker of that still lasts today.
I think even now, if a man is raped or a boy is raped or goes through sexual abuse, there's a real reticence to talk about it. because of that old bias and what other people's hang up is about it.
Yeah, and hopefully we can bring some of that history, because for me it was really eye-opening to see this in laws and in the social things that are going on at the time, and then to connect that to now. When Parnell is 18 or 19 years old, he marries a woman named Patsy. She was 15. California is one of the few states that does not have a minimum age to marry, which really surprised me. I kind of thought, I knew people of a certain age could get permission, but I kind of thought there would be some sort of minimum age.
And that's still now? There's no minimum age to marry?
Yes. In fact, 2017, someone tried to pass a law to make the minimum age, I think 18, and it didn't.
It didn't win?
No, it didn't get very far. In fact, several organizations were against it. There was opposition from the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. Just they didn't really feel. So what happens now in California is if you want to get married, there's no age limit. You need to, but if you're underage, under 18, you need to get a parent or legal guardian's permission, and then a judge has to okay it.
Oh, it's not like anybody can get married if they're underage. There's hoops you have to jump through.
Yeah, there's a couple hoops. But if you can get a parent to sign off and a judge, which sometimes judges aren't always the greatest, it does happen. You can get an okay to get married. And in fact, when this bill, when they were talking about it and going through, there were several women who came forward and said that they had been married off at really young ages to much, much older men. They didn't want to. It was something their parents said with them. I think somebody was in a cult.
Oh, coercion. Wow.
And California isn't the only state. Texas just recently changed this, but I know it's had some issues with really underage marriage.
Texas upgraded before California on changing
Yes.
Wow, cool.
Yes.
California.
Although I think the bill is still hopefully going through some changes. One of the changes that they made was to at least increase the oversight. So a judge will get to now interview kids privately if they're trying to get married, so that an adult can't coerce you. So if kids are being abused or hurt, a judge might not realize that unless they get to talk to them privately. So that's hopefully a change that will go through. I don't know. The other thing that doesn't happen in California is the people who are for this bill said that there are about 3,000 marriages per year that include a minor. But it's difficult to tell if that's true or not because we do not keep track of how many people get married under the age of 18.
But that could also be, that's just a hard skewed stat, because what if it's an 18-year-old marrying a 17-year-old? I don't know what your thoughts are, if you hate that, but I'm just like high school sweetheart kind of thing. I don't know. Would that stat be in there?
No, we don't keep any stats. So I don't know where they got this 3,000
The 3,000.
from. I think probably keeping some stats would be a good first step. Then we could even see what the issue is.
Well, yeah, it's public record, right? Nobody. That's kind of shocking to me that there isn't statistics on. You have to file for a marriage license,
right? But then someone has to keep track of it, of the age.
No one. So there, there's no one on the back end recording thing,
right? So it's impossible, and it's not impossible, perhaps. But it's obviously people have come forward and said this happened to them as kids. But how many and how big an issue this is still not something we really understand here in California.
Well, if you're listening to this and live in California, then you can call your assemblyman and have them vote, I guess, for voting for the oversight, but
yeah,
or
creating
an actual age.
Hi, I'm Roseanne, host of the California Dreaming Podcast, a show that delves into the darker side of the not-so-golden state. Together, we will visit some of the most unhinged and chilling crimes that ever shook California and beyond. Join me as I take you on a journey into a new story each week with a different backdrop from all around California, from the bright lights and glamour of Hollywood to the picturesque and tranquil wine country. No crime, no town, nobody is off limits. Listen to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network or anywhere you listen to podcasts.
So Parnell marries Patsy at the Sunshine Church of Bakersfield. They were married for about a year or so when Parnell pretended to be a police officer and walked up to a group of kids in Bakersfield, showed a badge he had bought at a military surplus store, and told the kids they needed to come with him. He was able to convince one of the boys, an 8-year-old, to get into his car, and he drove him somewhere outside of Bakersfield where he sexually assaulted him. He then took the boy back to his neighborhood and dropped him off where the boy's father called the police. Parnell was arrested and would tell a psychiatrist that he thought about strangling the boy instead of bringing him home. He was convicted of impersonating a police officer and lewd and lascivious behavior. A court-appointed psychologist would determine Parnell was a sexual psychopath. When I first heard this term, I just didn't really think too much about it, knowing what Parnell does later. But actually, the term sexual psychopath is a pretty loaded term and was part of the laws at the time, so we're going to discuss that. So in the 1930s in California, the first laws for sexual psychopaths were passed. And in the 1950s, progressives in California pushed for some changes to the laws. And we're not talking, just to clarify, about 2019 progressives. We're talking about the Progressive Party in California in the 30s and 40s and 50s. One of the biggest changes was no longer seeing a sex crime as just a crime, seeing it more as a mental disorder, something that you could fix. Progressives saw people going to jail for sex crimes and thought that that was kind of a waste. Where people go to jail, they get out, they commit more sex crimes. To them, they thought if you could help fix the person, then they could stop going to jail. One of the bigger problems is several things, is that, as I said, being gay at the time was considered a sex crime. Sodomy was considered a sex crime. But obviously hurting a child like this is considered a sex crime. So you're mixing in all sorts of things. People who look in a window and get caught, people who are raping people, people who are committing sexual assault or molesting someone, and then people who are just having sex with another man, for instance. These are all things that are mixed together.
They're weighted the same, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, they're all considered sex crimes.
So if I'm a gay man, then I am just as guilty of this crime as Parnell, who raped a child.
Well, the bigger point at this time, there are different levels, and we'll go through them in a second. There are 4 different levels of a sexual psychopath. So they're not all considered the same weight or the same, I don't know, terribleness is probably not the right legal term. But according to progressives, though, at the time, their idea is that these are all crimes that can be fixed. They can fix you so that you don't keep going to jail for them. And all 4 of these, to different, your psychiatrist might come up with a different plan if you have hurt a child than if you were caught having consensual sex with another, person of age.
And we are still talking about, at this period in California history, these people are looking at being gay as a mental problem, something to be fixed.
Yeah, and we're talking about a time when police are also using these laws specifically to go after people who are, in this case, we're talking about people who are gay. So these are certain groups of people who are saying, if you're continually going to jail for something that can be fixed, we should fix that so you don't continually go to jail. It's terrible plan to just have people constantly be in jail for the rest of their lives. So this is a new way of looking at, a new progressive way of looking at a problem. The problem is, we now know you can't, being gay is not a fixable problem. It's not a problem. It's just...
It's the way you're born, but it kind of goes back to the reform school, out of this idea that I'm going to fix and help these kids, and then that turns into something terrible. This idea that I want to reform the prison system so people aren't getting sent away for things that they can't control, but you're not looking at the problem. You're attacking the problem terribly, so you're just causing more hurt and more harm instead of actually going after people, in this case like Parnell, who are actually assaulting children. You're going after people who are the way they are, but for the most of the rest of the community is seen as being sick or ill.
Yeah, and there's a whole host of stereotypes and sort of weird ideas attached to what makes someone a sexual psychopath. So I'll just go over the 4 types at this time. So what makes someone a sexual psychopath is if they have a predisposition, which means they have committed a crime more than once, whether it's rape or looking in someone's window, and if they're menaceful, if they're aggressive. So the more you have either of those 2 things, the higher you're going to go on the list. So the first group is called abnormal sex acts not considered menaceful. These are for a group of people that they describe as they can't control their sexual impulses, but they're not dangerous. They're not hurting people. They're not aggressive. They're not forcing people to do anything. So this would include, this is the list that they give, homosexual activity with consensual adults, transvestitism, voyeurism, exhibition or indecent exposure, as long as you're adults, fetishism, pornography, coprophilia, bestiality, cunnilingus, fellatio, and sodomy, and these are all between adults and consensually. So that's considered the first sort of least, I don't know, it's still against the law. It's still a problem. You might end up in a mental institution, but these are considered the less serious sexual offenses.
And that's the law at this time, not in 2019, obviously, but
in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, yeah. And this category cannot involve children, so that would automatically hit it up to the next.
It's pretty crazy that the 50s would still take on one side pornography and one side bestiality and say, it's the same thing.
Yeah, this is really hard. This is honestly really hard to talk about, and it's really hard to research because it's just so uncomfortable and different to what we sort of accept now and know. But yeah, this is exactly what was written into the law.
I mean, I guess sometimes we forget that that's not that long ago. I mean,
No.
for some of us, that's our parents, when our parents were growing up, and to see that those laws were on the books and it was just considered normal, like that's all right. It's absolutely,
well, it's illegal, but yeah, that it was
yeah,
okay
you're right.
that
It's
it was
not
illegal.
okay, but everybody looked at that and said, yeah, that's pornography or fetishism or things like that, wherein that should be illegal, that it's bad and needs to be stamped out.
The second category is not predisposed to commission of sexual offenses. This was a category that was really hard for me to pin down, and I think probably all four of these categories will change depending on what judge you might get, which is probably very frustrating. But in this category, for instance, they had a couple of ideas for what it could be under this offense. For instance, one was an older boy had touched a young girl's genitals, and the police and the judge believed that this was just curiosity. I believe he was babysitting, and so it wasn't considered menaceful or that he had a predisposition to doing this again. But then another case had an older man, a full-grown adult, who had sex with his 13-year-old stepdaughter. He had told the judge that he did this because his wife stopped being nice to him and because he had spent a lot of time with her and that he was seduced. So he fell into the second category, according to the judge, because he wasn't responsible for his actions. It's not something he would have done under any other time. The young girl seduced him. I know, it's ridiculous. It is hard to talk about, but this happened. And so I really feel like to understand all this, it's really important to go through it, but it's frustrating.
But and you really see how a generation's views of the world affect that. Like, especially that second category, it seems like that is the weird category that is really left up to the judge then. They're the ultimate arbiter of whether you wouldn't normally do this or you would, right?
Right. I honestly think depending on the judge you get, you might fall, if you are maybe someone who was gay who had sex with a consensual adult, if the judge thought you fell under the higher category, he could just put you there. I don't know. I mean, there's a whole process, and we'll go through that in a second, but I really think a lot of this is up to interpretation.
Which could lead you then to a mental institution or into jail. Right?
Right. Well, both. Because if you go to a mental institution under this law, it is not in place of jail. So both? You go and get help, and then when you're done getting help, you go to jail. You get the same.
Oh, so I'm now quote unquote cured. I've done my penance of mental rehabilitation. Now I get to go do my time
Right. It's not in place of jail time. So you can't use this. You can't use this as a reason or a way to get around going to jail.
Is it the same amount of time?
Yes.
So you'd still have to... So did a lot of these people just say, just send me to jail because they didn't want to go to a hospital and then add more time on?
Well, the thing is that it was up to 3 people could ask to be determined if they were a sexual psychopath. One is the defendant. You could ask yourself. The second is the prosecutor, and the third is a judge. So if a judge or prosecutor sent you to go... You had been arrested, you go to trial. A judge says, okay, you might be a sexual psychopath. He sends you to superior court where you have another small trial where they say, yeah, you could be or couldn't be. Then they send you to see a psychiatrist, I believe, to get evaluated. And if that person says yes, then you go to a mental institution where they will, I think 90 days, they watch you and kind of determine, again, you have to get determined again after that 90 days whether or not you're a sexual psychopath. If you weren't in superior court, if someone had evaluated you, you weren't, then you go straight to jail or back to court to get tried. If you were, you go for the 90 days. If after the 90 days, the psychiatrists there say you are, then you go, they'll create a whole plan for you, a whole mental evaluation, and what, they send you back for how many ever days they think you need to be there. If not, then you go back to trial and go back to jail.
And regardless, the end result is you're going to prison at some point.
Right, because you can't...
I mean, if you're found guilty.
Yeah, it doesn't take the place. So someone can't come in and say, oh, I'm a sexual psychopath and avoid going to jail.
Yeah.
So that argument about this all being progressive and, look at all these people and we're going to be helping these people because they can't help themselves, it leading to the same spot as the people just saying it's illegal.
Well, you still have to do...
You have to do your penance. You're paying for the quote unquote crime. And again, I'm not talking about the assault on the children. We're talking about like the level 1 overabundance of pornography, or I have a fetish.
Right. Most of these probably in the first couple levels, you're just going to go to jail. You're probably not going to spend a lot of time at a mental hospital. But we do know that happens, which is why I say I think some of this is obviously up into interpretation at the time. Someone might move you up the ladder based on how often it's happened, based on your predisposition, or whether someone interpreted it as menaceful. So the third group of sexual psychopaths are called incorrigible sociopaths. These are people who are always in trouble for all sorts of things. They seem just incapable of following the rules. Maybe it sort of sounded almost like they described them as hippies. That's obviously not the word that they use, but they just like doing their own thing. They didn't really like society's idea of what they should be doing. And so any kind of sex acts or illegal sex acts that they committed was just sort of looked at like they didn't have some problem with them sexually or some deviant behavior. They just couldn't, for whatever reason, follow the rules. Again, a category that seems ripe for people misinterpreting or putting people up into it. And then the last category, which is the most dangerous and the most serious, and is actually called sexual psychopaths, are for people who cannot control their sexual impulses. And these acts usually involve a child. So Parnell immediately goes into this category because he's hurt a kid. And these are the most menaceful to society. And often, as they'll find out, the category of people who have a predisposition for committing these crimes more than once. And so this whole system has obviously a lot of problems. The first is that people are caught up in it who I think now we would never think that they would be caught up in it. And the other problem is that right away people start to see that people who hurt kids often do that again. So someone like Parnell will come into the system. He'll probably go to a mental institution. He'll get help. He'll go to jail. He'll get out, and he'll do it again. It's common for this type of person to repeat this crime. There's also just a lot of weird stereotypes and ideas based on like seduction, as we talked about earlier, where the man was seduced by his 13-year-old, and whether or not force or what force really is, who can be forced to do something. Can a woman really be forced to have sex with her husband? Is that really rape? Stuff like that. The age of 16 is also considered the age of adulthood at the time, basically because sexual maturity was thought to have happened when you reached the age of 16. And they believed, or the law believed, that you should be able to resist a sex act without aggression. So you really, if you're 16, you shouldn't really be able to be coerced into having sex at the time. So there's just all sorts of stuff that we don't really believe in now, or the law doesn't believe in, and it just kind of messes with the whole history. The judge in the trial labels Parnell as a, quote, homosexual of the more or less dangerous type, and sent him to the Metropolitan State Hospital at Norwalk.
So this is an actual quote by the judge?
Yes.
A homosexual of more or less dangerous type?
Yes.
Okay, so that's ridiculous. I mean, he's extremely dangerous for what he did by taking a boy, and then that's ridiculous.
It's a quote where you can really see everything is wrapped up in just a really frustrating way, because his sexuality has nothing to do with whether or not he hurt a child.
Right.
And it's just really frustrating to see.
Well, the legal system at the time equating the two, that somebody who raped a child, automatically, we're going to say he's gay. That's, like you said, that has nothing to do with the other. But they're putting, again, those things as on the same level. It's almost like an excuse.
And we haven't gotten there yet, but later we'll talk about some of the ideas in the 70s and 80s about boys or men who've been raped or abused. And to me, you can really see the thread of that. These are laws. These are encoded in laws about people who are gay. And it all connects in a way, I think, if that makes sense. So Parnell goes to the Norwalk Mental Institution. He will go there more than once. He will try and run away from them several times. And some of the things that would happen there for treatment-wise are, group therapies. Electric shock was really common and utilized later in conversion therapy, drugs, and also places like this would often sterilize people. Parnell also had to register as a sex offender. So in the 1930s, the mafia or the mob had taken kind of control of a lot of larger cities in the United States. In LA, the sheriff came up with an idea to kind of protect people against the mob. He would create a list, and everybody who committed a felony would be added to this list. So on top of a felony, you could also be added to the list if you had some low-level drug charges or some weapons charges. Or if you came to stay in LA County, it was a sheriff who took control of this list, came to stay in the county for 5 days or more, and you had a felony. So you would be added to this list so that everybody would know who you were, or the police would know who you were, actually, and would be able to track you, kind of protect people against the mob. So at this time, sex crimes are a felony. So a lot of people who are breaking the laws we just talked about will end up on this list. So if you committed those crimes, you were automatically added to the list. And there became a fight at this time between people who wanted to protect children and people who didn't want the government involved in their bedroom. So a lot of people thought this list was a good idea. We're trying to keep kids from getting hurt. And there were a lot of people who were just like, no, stay out of all of our lives. In the 40s, the law expanded with the help of the PTA in LA County to include lewd or lascivious acts on or with a child under 14, sex perversions like oral sex, indecent exposure, lewd vagrancy, rape, which would be intercourse with a non-wife female under 18, or by force, threat, or guile, involuntary abduction of a woman for marriage or sex, crimes against nature, specifically that would include anal sex, with a man or animal, and or molest school children, so mainly just to bother a school child, or loiter around a school with children present.
Two things. First off, it's a non-wife, right?
Yes, that's what I read. Yes.
So again, I'm free to rape my wife and it still not be considered illegal. Before you go on with that.
Well, to be frank, it's not totally illegal everywhere. I believe just this week, another state finally made it illegal to rape your wife. So this is not that surprising of a thing. No.
And again, it's been what we've been talking about a lot is that idea of criminalizing people being gay.
Yes, because one of the biggest things that happens here is that this list include situations, and it doesn't really matter if oral or anal sex was consensual, and it will include people who are married. So we've talked a lot about how, and this really will be aimed, this list will change and be aimed a lot at keeping people who are gay on the list and controlling certain types of communities. But you can be married, and if you commit sodomy, be arrested and put on this list. Most counties in California like this idea, and they adopt similar lists. So in Kern County, where Parnell will have to register, they adopt one of these lists. In 1947, California added the Penal Code 290, which is basically still what we use today to require people to register. And it will include these categories: rape on a non-wife female by force, threat, or drugs, entice a chaste female under 18 or trick her into having sex, abduct a female under 18 into prostitution without a parent's permission, seduction, which is having sex with a woman by promise of marriage, incest, sodomy, lewd or lascivious act on or with a child under 14, sex perversions, oral sex, indecent exposure, annoy or molest a child, loiter around school children, or lewdly contribute to the delinquency of a person under 21.
So it's okay to put a girl into prostitution as long as you have parents' consent?
Yeah, that's specifically what was in the law. I didn't look it up. I don't know. It also surprised me that specifically said it that way.
Yeah,
but
that wording is weird.
And as we enter in the late 1950s, we'll start to have basically a full-on sex panic in California and in a lot of other places where people are really worried that what you're doing in the bedroom is going to be hurting kids. And a lot of that just becomes part of the law. And this sort of registry, other states start to pick it up. In the 90s, Congress passes an act that everyone should have these registries. And in 2003, Congress passes a law that these lists should be put on the internet. So I think that's something we're all kind of accustomed to now. But at the time when Parnell is put on the list in the 50s, the lists are mainly used as a way to track people who are gay and to follow them to know where they go, to where they meet each other, and to keep arresting them and putting them in jail and harass them, that kind of thing.
Meanwhile, while it's criminalizing the gay community and forcing them even deeper into hiding, and police are going after them, somebody like Parnell, who's going to commit more of these crimes, he's getting away. I mean, how is the registry affecting somebody like that?
So a big part of the issue here is that it's the 50s. He gets put on this list. The list he's on is the one for Kern County. Not all the lists are connected. And so Parnell will eventually, we'll talk about this in a minute, but he will move out of the area. He's supposed to keep police apprised of where he is, but there's not as many mechanisms for doing that as there are today. And he will give them addresses, which it doesn't look like he's actually staying at. And I just don't know that there's enough police in Bakersfield or sheriffs really to go check up on him and all that stuff. So yeah, they're using it, like you said, to track down and to harass people who are gay. And someone like Parnell, who in theory maybe they should be tracking down, is sort of just going to go off the map. And in 1950, just to drive this point home, 90% of people who made it onto these lists were charged with sex charges, the sex charges were sex perversion. Those were the specific charges, which were primarily used at the time to track people who were gay. It's one of the reasons the words pervert or sex offender became sort of synonymous with the word gay or gay people. At the time that Parnell had committed this first crime against this little boy, his wife had been pregnant. And after he goes through this trial and everything, he and his wife break up, and he wasn't allowed to see his child. He would tell his mother that his wife met another man, and that's why she left him. And I want to talk for a minute about manipulation, which is a very common thing we'll discuss throughout this story, and as well when we cover Carrie Stayner. But manipulating people, all kinds of people, finding the ways each individual can be manipulated is essential, and something a man like Parnell and lots of other people who commit horrendous sex crimes are very capable of. If you've listened to other podcasts about this story, or even other stories where people did things that are basically unbelievable to you, I think the thing to keep in mind is that if you're human, you're capable of being manipulated. But whatever thing or story someone needs to tell you to get you to act in a way they prefer, it's going to be different. But lying, manipulating to fit in, to get people to do what you want is a big part of this. And some of the worst people in the world have this skill in spades. And this is just a small example, but lying to his mother about why he and his wife break up is a hint at the kind of manipulations he's capable of. Later in life, Parnell would do an interview and say this about hurting the small boy. Quote, "I think this happened was, my wife was pregnant, and she was just too big for me, I guess, and I had to find another outlet," unquote. Which is a really disgusting thing to say. It was hard for me to read out loud, but also in many ways probably another manipulation, either to the reporter or to himself, and just him trying not to take responsibility for his own actions.
Well, it's the same as the man with the 13-year-old stepdaughter. It's like the same kind of thing.
Same manipulation. Yeah. There's some other reason external to myself.
It's not me, right?
And whether he believes that or whether he's just lying because he's really good at that is hard to know. He would also spend 3.5 years in San Quentin. He would be paroled once, but violate that parole and ultimately get out in 1956. He, as I said, he also registered as a sex offender in Kern County, and he was supposed to keep them apprised of where he lived. After jail, he would register as a sex offender. He said he was living in San Francisco a couple of times. He used an address on Franklin Street. However, there isn't too much evidence to say that he actually ever lived in San Francisco.
So again, he shows up and just, excuse me, he tells the police, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm living in San Francisco. I got an apartment.
Right.
I'm doing my duty."
But there's no actual evidence that's where he was.
Does it say, do you know what he violated his parole for?
Yes, at least one of the times he violates his parole, he becomes obsessed with a small child. I don't know who it is or where it is or what exactly happens, but at least one of the other times he escapes a mental institution, it's to track down this child and find him. So at least once or twice he goes back to prison for the same sorts of charges. While supposedly living in San Francisco, he would marry another woman named Emma, who was about 10 years older than him and lived in Oildale, California. Oildale, California is an unincorporated town just a couple miles outside Bakersfield. Although it's bigger than most places we've talked about that are unincorporated. In 2010, it has a little over 32,000 people living there.
That's a huge place for an unincorporated town.
I'm used to thinking those places as just, a few hundred people live there. That's why they're unincorporated. It's surrounded by 3 large oil fields, as the name suggests, and it's actually where Merle Haggard was born. The paper would hint that perhaps Parnell had not been staying where he had let authorities know he was staying. Partially, I mean, he's supposed to be living in San Francisco, but he's marrying someone from Oildale, although I imagine that's possible. He's perhaps already moving around, something he will really do later in this story.
Again, I mean, there's no internet. The counties probably aren't discussing back and forth the registry. So it's another instance of it's not a bad idea to have a registry for these violent people, but there's no follow through on it.
Yeah, in Parnell's case, perhaps, yeah. But yeah, they're not keeping track of where he is. Emma, his wife, would give birth to a daughter. There isn't anything I can find that makes it seem as if he has much contact with her or his family. In 1960, Parnell was arrested and convicted of armed robbery and grand larceny in Utah. The newspaper also says he had been living in Phoenix at one point, so he isn't giving his address correctly to authorities in California, and he's moving around a lot. He goes to prison in Utah for 6 years. His wife Emma divorces him and receives a court order prohibiting him from seeing their child. Once out of prison, he is given 24 hours to leave the state, which isn't an uncommon thing for states to do when people aren't citizens of that state. They're citizens of another state. He made his way back to California and spends the next few years doing something again I believe he's already doing, but definitely something people will notice and take interest in once he's found to have kidnapped a child, which is move around a lot. He works odd jobs. He's basically a drifter, which I do want to say when people talk about this, obviously in this case, this type of lifestyle helped him stay under the radar. So it seems very strange and insidious, but in California, and I imagine in a lot of states, there are a lot of jobs in which people move around. Farm work, truck driving. So it's not the job necessarily that's a problem. It's just in this case, he's using that as sort of a way to move around. During this time, he also comes into contact with law enforcement several times. I couldn't find what kinds of things he had done, but he does get sent to Norwalk State Hospital a couple of more times. And we talked about why he was sent there before. So knowing that, it's hard to know what crimes he committed, but they might be quite similar. Most of the time that Parnell spends before he's given a job at Yosemite in 1972 is unknown. His mother would tell a reporter that he wasn't in California, Utah, or Arizona during that time, which is a really weird way to answer a question when someone says, "Where has your son been?" So it's a lot of unaccounted time. And for me, even though this is looking at the past and it's already happened, it creeped me out knowing that nobody knew where he was during this time.
Or what he was doing, or
yeah, it's just not someone you don't want to know where they are. And this takes us to 1972 when Parnell is hired by Yosemite Lodge in the Yosemite National Valley, and we're actually going to stop there for tonight. This will be our first episode. It was mainly on Kenneth Parnell, and next episode we will begin to cover the beginning of his kidnapping of Steven Stayner, and we'll really focus on actually for episode 2 what the family goes through. So before we go tonight, we are going to do one last thing that we've started, which is to cover a cold case.
Our cold case for this episode is a missing persons case from Atwater, California. The information comes from the Charlie Project. Pamela Pedro has been missing from Atwater, California since September 13th, 1982. Pamela was 17 years old the last time she was seen. That morning, she had been dropped off at school and was last seen talking on a payphone. She's of Filipino descent with black hair and dark brown eyes. At the time of her disappearance, she was wearing a blue and pink checkered shirt, blue corduroy pants, and blue Nike shoes. She also had braces, large framed glasses, a dimple on her cheek, and a mole under her right eye. Pamela Pedro's parents reported her missing after her mother attempted to pick her up after school and no one could find her. The Merced police have listed her as a possible runaway, but there is no evidence indicating what happened to her. Pamela Pedro was a senior at Atwater High School and an advanced student, a classical pianist, an acrobatics enthusiast, and had a black belt in karate. She had plans to graduate early. If you have any information about the disappearance of Pamela Pedro, please contact the Merced Sheriff's Department at 209-385-7444.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you would like to contact us, you can find us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, all at Cali True Crime. If you want to email us, you can email at calitruecrime@gmail.com. Don't forget to go to our episodes page at californiatruecrime.com. You can also, if you like the episodes, help us out by going to Patreon and supporting the podcast. We'd also like to thank our quality control czar, Melanie Duncan. This episode has been produced at Chateau Walnut.